2014. The black flag of ISIS rose over the Middle East. Behind the scenes, the wives of the organization's leaders became targets. Some were arrested. Others were executed by the very men they once served. Footage from inside the caliphate shows the reality. The camera records empty streets, public executions, and women forced into silence. It was a hidden world of brutality. How did this terror begin? It started much earlier. The date was March 2003. The invasion of Iraq began. Within weeks, the Iraqi government collapsed. The state vanished. The consequences were immediate. The Americans dissolved the National Army. Police forces abandoned their posts. Millions of Iraqis lost their protection and their salaries in a single day. People were left with nothing but weapons. The footage shows the result. Plumes of black smoke over Baghdad, burning Humvees, rubble in the streets of Fallujah. Violence became a daily routine. Car bombings destroyed markets. Kidnappings became a business. Revenge killings occurred in broad daylight. At first glance, it was chaos, but in reality, it was an opportunity. Armed groups entered the vacuum. They promised order through the barrel of a gun. By 2004, one man took control of the most violent faction. His name was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He built a network that the world would soon know as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. His methods were different. He used beheadings as a recruitment tool. He targeted civilians to provoke civil war. Even other insurgent groups feared his brutality. But his reign had a limit. June 7, 2006, two 500-pound bombs hit a safe house. Zarqawi was dead. The group should have collapsed, but it did not disappear. Instead, the survivors regrouped. In October 2006, they rebranded. They called themselves the Islamic State of Iraq. This was a signal to the world. They were no longer just a shadow network of insurgents. The goal had changed. They no longer wanted to just fight. They wanted to rule. Events accelerated. Thus began the transition from a local militia to a global threat. 100% control. That was the foundation. From the very beginning, the group watched every fighter. Loyalty tests were constant. The leadership pulled entire families into the system by design. Wives were not private individuals. They were tools. A woman's behavior reflected her husband's standing. One mistake meant punishment for the fighter, the wife, and the children. This system dictated the group's evolution. April 2010. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi took command after the deaths of the previous leaders. Why was he so obsessed with secrecy? It was a matter of survival. At that time, the organization was dying. Raids and arrests had gutted the ranks. Baghdadi rebuilt the structure in the shadows. He avoided the spotlight and focused on internal loyalty. But this was only the beginning. Baghdadi believed the greatest threat was not the American military or local police. He feared betrayal from within. Trust disappeared. Punishment became the primary language of the group. Even a minor error led to an execution or a public beating. As Baghdadi tightened his grip, the fear moved from the battlefield into the home. The footage from captured safe houses shows the reality. Small, windowless rooms, no personal items. Wives of commanders lived under constant surveillance. Why were they targeted? They lived closest to the secrets. These women knew the locations of safe houses, the movement of cash, and the identities of high-ranking visitors. They were never left alone. It got worse. Security teams moved families between cities without warning. They confiscated mobile phones. They intercepted letters and digital messages. Neighbors received orders to report unusual sounds or visitors. Inside the home, women were expected to be invisible. They had to see nothing and say nothing. There was no mistake. Asking the wrong question or showing a hint of doubt brought immediate consequences. If a fighter failed a mission, the group blamed his wife. If a husband was suspected of treason, the security units interrogated his family first. By 2012, the fear was absolute. This was the environment of the group. Syria provided Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi with a strategic vacuum. The border collapsed. Chaos spread through the countryside, and his organization moved into the gap without facing resistance. fighters moved across the desert in convoys. Then came the orders for their families to follow. Why did the women go? They were promised a divine mission and physical safety. Recruiters spoke of a better life and religious purity. But the reality on the ground was different. Movement stopped at the front door. Rules became absolute. Leaving the house without a male guardian was forbidden. Homes turned into high-security zones. Guards stood on street corners while informants watched the neighbors. Privacy vanished. Every conversation was monitored. What started as a promise of protection became a cage. By the time the women realized the danger, the exits were closed. June 10, 2014. Everything changed in 48 hours. ISIS fighters drove into Mosul on the back of pickup trucks. This was Iraq's second-largest city. 2 divisions of the Iraqi army simply disintegrated. Soldiers stripped off their uniforms and ran. They left behind Humvees, body armor, and massive depots of American-made weapons. The militants didn't just take the guns, they raided the central banks. They seized hundreds of millions of dollars in cash and gold. How did Baghdadi respond to this victory? He stepped out of the shadows. He climbed the pulpit of the great mosque of Al-Nuri in Mosul. He declared the birth of a caliphate. This was a shift in status. They were no longer a hidden insurgency, they were a self-proclaimed state. 8 million people suddenly lived under their black flag. The territory stretched from the suburbs of Baghdad to the edges of Aleppo. They chose Raqqa, a city in northern Syria, as their administrative capital. Power did not bring peace, it brought paranoia. Ruling a territory meant having fixed addresses. ISIS now operated offices, tax bureaus, courts, and prisons. They had a bureaucracy. They had a paper trail. The leadership became obsessed with internal threats. Anyone with access to secrets was now a liability. Security became the only priority. This included the inner circle and the very people who built the system. There was no room for error. There was no trust. The hunt for traitors began immediately. The wives of commanders faced a new reality. These women were no longer treated as family members. They became assets. They became potential threats. ISIS leadership believed secrets leaked through the household. A wife might talk to a neighbor over a fence. A child might repeat an innocent detail that compromised a military operation. Because of this fear, normal family life vanished. ISIS needed total control. They expanded the Amniyat. This was the internal security branch. The group functioned as secret police. Its members followed fighters to their homes. They questioned families. They searched for any sign of disloyalty in the kitchen or the bedroom. By late 2014, accusations spread. If a commander was killed or arrested, his family received no sympathy. They received suspicion. They were viewed as accomplices. At first glance, a grieving family. But in reality, a security breach. It got worse. Dozens of women married to senior figures were detained. This happened in cities like Mosul and Deir ez-Zor. The charges were specific. Some were accused of hiding secret phones under floorboards. Others were caught contacting relatives in government-controlled areas. This was a capital offense. Some were accused of planning to escape with their children to Turkey. In the ISIS system, intention was the same as guilt. Punishment followed no legal code. Decisions were made in minutes. The result was final. Women were locked in makeshift prisons or basements. Some were taken away in black vans. They were never seen again. Executions of wives began during this period. The killings were quiet. There were no public squares. No announcements were made to the local population. The footage shows shadows in dim hallways. The killings happened indoors. Bodies were buried in unmarked trenches. No records were kept. No names were written. But between late 2014 and early 2015, the system changed. It became more brutal. Members began filming punishments that were never meant for the public eye. These were not the high-quality propaganda videos used to recruit foreigners. These recordings were raw. They were meant for an internal audience only. The footage records. A handheld camera shakes in a small room. The clips were short. They were brutal. The story took a darker turn. The footage is low quality. The scenes were recorded on cheap mobile phones in dim rooms or stripped-out concrete buildings. There is no professional editing. There is no dramatic music. The raw silence carries its own weight. These videos were not designed for recruitment or public propaganda. They served as internal proof. A commander needed to see that an order was executed. 2017. The caliphate began to collapse. Iraqi intelligence units and international journalists entered liberated zones. They searched abandoned safe houses and tunnels. They recovered hundreds of smashed hard drives, burnt phones, and hidden memory cards. Many files were corrupted, but some remained intact. Technicians recovered short video clips that had never reached the internet. Analysts examined the metadata. They checked timestamps and GPS coordinates. The data placed the recordings between late 2014 and early 2015. The locations were specific: Mosul, Raqqa, the outskirts of Fallujah. The footage shows women standing in empty courtyards. Some are being beaten, others are being executed. The charges were always the same: espionage or betrayal. The camera operator stays behind the victims. Their faces are rarely shown. No names are spoken aloud. This was a deliberate tactic. ISIS did not want to create martyrs. They wanted to erase these people from history entirely. Investigators traced the identities through local informants. Several victims were wives of high-ranking ISIS commanders. These men had either defected, been captured by the Iraqi army, or were suspected of leaking secrets. In the logic of the group, a wife was a security leak. Her innocence did not matter. Her existence was a risk. The sound of a single gunshot ends the recording. The screen goes black. The file ends. This was the final stage of their justice. No trial, no record, only a digital file for a superior to delete. One bullet. That was the price to close a loose end. Eliminating her was a calculated move to erase a witness. Years later, grainy clips began to leak onto the internet. Confusion followed immediately. Hundreds of videos circulated with false labels and misleading titles. Some footage came from different wars. Other clips were digitally altered or staged. This chaos made it easy for the public to dismiss the evidence as a rumor. But specialists began the work. They analyzed the metadata and the terrain. They confirmed that a small number of recordings were authentic. These clips matched known ISIS execution sites and specific dates. The data fit perfectly. The verified footage proved a grim fact. ISIS was killing its own members from the inside. This internal purge started long before the caliphate began to crumble in early 2015. By that time, the tide had turned. The group was being pushed back on multiple fronts. January 2015 marked the end of the battle for the Syrian town of Kobani. It was a total failure for ISIS. The defeat was a shock to the system. For the first time, the world watched the group lose a major fight in real time. The image of invincibility was gone. It got worse. Airstrikes by the United States and its allies intensified across Syria and Iraq. The sound of jet engines became constant. Surveillance drones circled 24 hours a day. Precise strikes destroyed underground weapons depots. High-ranking leaders were vaporized from the air while driving in convoys. Using a radio or a cell phone became a death sentence. Communication lines snapped. Trust disappeared. Inside the ranks, doubt spread like a virus. Foreign fighters from Europe and North Africa began to question the high command. Some soldiers tried to relocate to safer zones away from the front lines. Others held secret meetings to plan their escape across the border. This terrified the commanders. A single defector could expose supply routes, bank accounts, and secret bunkers. The response was brutal. ISIS stopped looking at the enemy and turned its gaze inward. Suspicion defined every interaction. The footage shows the change. Guards stood at every corner. Intelligence officers monitored every meeting. Informants reported private conversations to the religious police. No one was safe. Investigations expanded to include the families of the militants. The wives of foreign commanders were flagged as high-risk targets. Many of these women spoke 3 or 4 languages. They had the skills to negotiate with smugglers. The The group viewed intelligence as a threat greater than any bomb. Every person was a potential spy. There was no turning back. January 2015. The caliphate began to crack from within. Many members still had families living in the outside world. They remembered their previous lives before the black flags rose. This memory became a threat to the leadership. In Raqqa, the religious police targeted the wives of foreign commanders. The husbands faced accusations of cowardice or secret plans to desert the front lines. Some men were thrown into basements, others simply vanished. The footage from the period shows empty streets and black banners. Then the raids began. Secret police took the women for interrogation. They came at 2 in the morning. They dragged mothers away while their children watched from the corners of the rooms. No warrants were issued. No evidence was presented to the families. A single accusation was enough to seal a fate. Did these women have a chance to defend themselves? Not even close. ISIS established internal tribunals, but these were not courts of law. There were no defense lawyers. There were no witnesses for the accused. Security officials sat behind desks and signed death warrants in minutes. Once the official reached a verdict, the process stopped. There was no system for appeal. Punishment was carried out in the same hour. But this was only the beginning. Testimonies from later defectors revealed a darker reality. At least 3 women were executed during these weeks. The charges were simple: aiding a husband's escape or knowing about a plan to flee. Their names disappeared from the records. The leadership never informed the families back home. ISIS suppressed the news to prevent any spark of sympathy among the ranks. They wanted total silence. The sound of explosions became constant. As coalition airstrikes intensified, high-ranking commanders died in their bunkers. These deaths created a logistical crisis for the group. Widows were left behind in the ruins. The ISIS leadership did not see them as grieving wives. They saw them as security risks. These women had heard too much. They knew the locations, the names, and the internal secrets of the high command. A new directive appeared. Widows were banned from returning to their home countries. They were trapped inside the borders of the caliphate. There was no way out. The leadership issued a final ultimatum. These women were reassigned as property. They were forced to marry new fighters or commanders immediately. There was no choice. It was a direct order. The cycle repeated. Mid-2015. For thousands of women across the caliphate, the realization hit. There was no future. Their husbands were dead in the rubble of Syria and Iraq. But the punishment did not end with a funeral. The rule was simple: widows had to remarry. Refusing a new fighter was treated as open defiance against the state. In the ISIS ideology, obedience was a lifelong contract. It did not expire when a husband died. Grief was banned. Independence was a crime. The state viewed a single woman as a security threat. One case from the middle of 2015 stood out. It even unsettled some rank-and-file members. A widow, identified only by her kunya, lost her husband in a Syrian airstrike. He had been a high-ranking commander. After the mourning period, she refused to marry another soldier. She did not organize a protest. She did not attempt to flee across the border. She did not speak out in the markets. She simply said no. The refusal was sufficient for a death sentence. ISIS officials accused her of rebellion. They executed her in private. There was no public announcement. Her name was scrubbed from the records. The message was clear. Even women who followed every rule for years were disposable. The moment they stopped serving a biological or political purpose, they were eliminated. Widowhood offered zero protection. It only increased the danger. Events accelerated in 2016. ISIS began losing its grip on Iraqi territory. The most significant blow landed in Mosul. October 17, 2016. Iraqi forces began the operation to retake the city. Coalition airstrikes pounded the outskirts. The footage shows columns of Humvees advancing through the desert. The encirclement was slow and deliberate. Supply lines were severed. Food vanished from the shelves. The power grid failed, leaving the city in total darkness. Mosul turned into a concrete cage. Inside the headquarters, the atmosphere shifted. Fear reached a breaking point. Commanders stopped sharing plans. They looked at each other with suspicion. Trust had vanished. The collapse was beginning.